I'm Pam Reed. I'm an elder at First Presbyterian, a clerk, and a member of the Mission Ministry of MVP. And I don't know why my video is not on, but.
I'm Ann Wasson, the pastor at Defiance.
Bruce Hammond, I'm a member of First Presbyterian Church in Tecumseh, and I'm on the task force that we're trying to get back into our sanctuary and so forth. I'm also on the Presbytery Discipleship Commission. So,
I'm Mary Beth McCandless. I'm the pastor of two small congregations in Northwest Ohio, and I also serve on the Committee on Ministry.
I'm Ken Wessler, the minister at the Presbyterian Church in Upper Sandusky.
Dear Dean and Ellen McGormley, honorably retired, and occasionally I'm a clerk of the Presbytery.
I'm Kathy Johnson. I'm a chaplain with the Adrian Dominican Sisters in their health care facility. So we're living daily with COVID restrictions and concerns.
Yeah, I'll bet you are.
Well, that's just
Pamela
about
Short,
everybody.
technologically challenged.
That's just about everybody. I am excited to have my friend and colleague in ministry, Lisa Allgood. And I have to apologize. In one of the emailings out to you all, I mistakenly referred to her as a physician. She's more of a researcher, as she's an immunologist, and she is a neurochemist, but not with an MD. So I shouldn't have probably used that term physician. Anyway, it's good to have you here, Lisa. And she's now the General Presbyter for Cincinnati Presbytery. So going from one kind of diagnostic field to another, right? And it's kind of fun. Glad you're here, Lisa. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's nice to see you all. I actually had the privilege of meeting Matt and the rest of the presbyters last year when we actually did get together face to face and got some really awesome photography shots of Fort Meigs. So it was sort of fun to be up that way. Just as way of introduction, I'm a New York City girl, born and bred. I graduated from the University of Medicine and Dentistry, New Jersey, with what's called a medical science doctorate. So I actually went through medical school, but never went through residency because my intent was never to practice. My intent was to research, and spent 36 years in the pharmaceutical industry. So first with Merck Sharp and Dohme in immunology, and then moved into clinical science and regulatory. So worked with boards of health on 5 different continents. But while I was an immunologist in the lab, worked with the predecessor to what's now HIV. It was HTLV 3 and 4 at the time, as well as rhinovirus. So I have a little bit of virology background, but did a lot of immunology work. And then moved out to Cincinnati in 1989 to work for Procter & Gamble as they were starting to get into the pharma world and into over-the-counter medicines. Retired from there. So I'm on my 3rd failed retirement, if you really want to know the fun part of me. I retired from P&G in 2015. Took a position with a small contract research organization here, MedPace in Cincinnati, for 3 years, retired from there in 2018. In 2017, I started working with the woman who was our general presbyter, had just come in. Her name is Nancy Cahan, brilliant woman. She came in, and even though she wasn't hired as an interim, she commissioned a small team that we called the Evaluate and Imagine team. And we did a year of dissecting of 30 years of Cincinnati Presbytery practice, everything from bylaws to finance to structure, on and on and on, and completely reconfigured it. And then she left pretty abruptly in February of 2019. So council said, hey, can you stay for 3 months and keep the lights on? And 17 months later, I'm still there. So this is my 3rd job. So God has a strange sense of humor, putting a pretend person in a presbyter position in a pandemic. But while I was actively working in the pharma world, I did a lot of contract work with CDC and with World Health. And so I still have access to a lot of their databases that aren't public. So I've been obviously following this with quite a bit of interest. It still tickles the left-hand side of my brain. So that's who I am. I have daughter who lives here in Cincinnati who's finishing up a doctorate in psychology, and another stepdaughter who lives out on the Outer Banks, who is blonde 30 and living the dream. So.
Fun. Well, thanks all for your introductions. And per usual, I will, well, someone will begin us with a devotion, but today I thought I would do that. So let us turn our hearts to God. A reading from Jeremiah, the 29th chapter. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. In those days, when you pray, I will listen. If you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. Let us pray. Loving God, your desire is for our wholeness and well-being. We hold in tenderness and prayer the collective suffering of our world at this time. We grieve precious lives lost and vulnerable lives threatened. We ache for ourselves and our neighbors, standing before an uncertain future. We pray, may love, not fear, go viral. Inspire our leaders to discern and choose wisely, aligned with the common good. Help us to practice social distancing and reveal to us new and creative ways to come together in spirit and in solidarity. Call us to profound trust in your faithful presence. You, O God, who does not abandon. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Lisa, we've had some fun conversations, and I just love having you as a colleague. It is so much fun being in Synod of the Covenant with people like you, just surrounded by so much diversity and collegiality. And at one point, when we were hanging out, I think in Toledo and Perrysburg somewhere, you said to me, "This is a quirky little virus." Tell us about SARS-CoV-2. Why is it a quirky little virus?
So part of the reason that it's a quirky little virus is it keeps surprising people with what it manifests. We had the first SARS a couple of years ago that came out of Southeast Asia, where a lot of the coronaviruses do, and everybody panicked and thought it was a pandemic, and then it petered out. It almost acted like a flu virus. It sort of abated when summer hit and never really became the pandemic that this one is. Then we had the Middle Eastern respiratory syncytial virus, which same thing, people panicked and, oh my gosh, here's the big one. And it did the same thing. It petered out after a little while. And both of them stayed fairly respiratory in nature. They were like bad flus or bad colds. That's not a great analogy, but you get the idea. This one is not that. This is a coronavirus. It is spread by respiratory droplets, and we can talk about how the infection is progressing, at least the understanding of it is. But this one affects a whole bunch of different body systems. I mean, in addition to creating what's called a cytokine storm, so when your immune response gets a virus, sometimes your immune response goes too far, and that actually can cause complications like pneumonia and agglomerate in your lungs. This one does that. However, it also affects the nervous system. That's why people are losing smell and taste. There are residual effects in the neurological system, everything from vascular events like seizures, but also cognitive function over 8 to 12 weeks at this point is what it's looking like. One woman in the UK was even diagnosed with psychoses. She saw ducks and I think lions or something like that in her bedroom, and she had COVID. And when they looked at a brain scan, there was definite damage that that looked like it had come from vascular events. It affects the GI tract. So some of the other lesser known symptoms, lesser abated symptoms are diarrhea and nausea. It affects the kidney. It affects the liver. And just recently, somebody came out and said it actually can attach to the islet cells in the pancreas, and so can be a cause of diabetes. So while diabetes is one of the predisposing factors to have complications due to COVID, in fact, it looks as if it hits the islet cells, decreases your insulin output, and creates diabetes. Now, nobody knows if that's long-term or short-term. So this thing goes all over the place. It's not just a respiratory virus. The infection rate on this and the way it's spread is still being discerned. And it obviously is not acting like the flu. And as a matter of fact, we've gotten a second, I won't say second wave, but a second peak in the first wave of virus, and it's lasting into the summer. That was expected because it actually maintained itself in the tropics the whole time it was coming out of China. And if you've ever been to Wuhan, that's part of the tropics of China. So it is a quirky little virus. There's not a lot known about it, and there's a whole lot of guesswork going on right now.
But there was a part of the conversation we had, you said that quirkiness was kind of making you hopeful though. Like maybe it wasn't mutating or it wasn't prone to mutate. I don't know if you want to talk about the chemistry behind it so much, but what was that hopefulness about?
Yeah, so the coronavirus, if you've probably all seen the pictures where it's got the little spikes that hang out, and that's the part that attaches to different cells. The mutation rate on this, there are 8 different known mutants out there right now. Most of them are basically quiescent. They're about as infectious as the original one that came out of Wuhan. The one that hit the East Coast, the one that hit New York and New Jersey, where my parents still live, actually came out of Europe. And that one had mutated to be more virulent. In other words, it infected at a higher rate. There's a factor that's called an R factor, and that number means the average number of people one infected person can infect around them. So if the R value is 2, on average, one infected person infects 2 other people. Obviously, part of the social distancing and the quarantining we've done was an attempt to suppress that R number. So one mutant has turned out to be more virulent. There's been one other mutant that has arisen in the US since then. It actually was found by CDC in Atlanta, probably is in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and it's actually slightly less virulent. Now, the only thing that's not known at this point is why this second peak. Most people are saying that it's because we opened too early and people aren't necessarily following all the masking and the social distancing rules, but it's not increased testing. It doesn't look to be increased testing, although that can be a factor. It's probably not the protests. If you look at a lot of the protest pictures, most people are wearing masks. It appears to just be community spread, just people going out, and that R factor is above 1, and so people are infecting people. And because that R factor is exponential, as soon as one person infects one, that one other person is going to infect 1 or 2 other people. It spreads very, very quickly. A lot of that spread, of course, too, is consolidated population. So nursing homes, prisons, hospitals, that's also part of the reason for the peak.
Does anybody else want to jump in and ask a question, or should I go on with mine? Okay, I just go on with mine. Lisa, tell us about possible treatments.
Sorry, I muted myself and I'm unmuting.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry, go ahead, Marta.
Yeah, so Lisa, I was going to ask a question. What I've been telling my people in our safety security committee at church is that it's primarily droplet spread, but there is some evidence there may be aerosol. And yes. So, and the masks are particularly useful for droplet spread. And for aerosol spread, it's really the biggest thing is distance, and well, not so much distance as it's the density of the particles. So right. Like indoor spread, close contact increases the density of the particles. So I think it's probably I would say like 80% droplet spread, but there is a component of aerosol spread that I think is worse in the winter. And for the non-technique geeks, the difference is that droplet spreads is the physics of the particles. So with droplet spread, it's like spit particles come out from your mouth and they're big enough that gravity pulls them down. Aerosol spread, it's more like those dust motes you see floating around in the air, in that they're light enough that they just kind of hang in the air longer. So that's the difference when you hear people talking about droplet and aerosol spread. Those are 2 kinds of airborne spread, and the issues involved are slightly different. So.
Exactly right. And that's actually one of the reasons behind the caution not to use ceiling fans and air conditioning in enclosed spaces without ventilation. Because if you think about what air conditioning and ceiling fans do, they take cold air from up high and push it down. And Marta's exactly right. The more hot and humid air, the faster those droplets are going to fall. But as you're pushing cold air down and spreading it out amongst people, what you're doing is taking both the aerosol and the droplets and spreading them out. And so there's only one study that's come out that's been published. I actually had one of my pastors go, yeah, but there's only one study. And I said, yeah, that's the one study you got. So you got to deal with the data. It actually showed a restaurant in Wuhan where, and I can send the link, or the picture if you want to see it, where there was no cross ventilation, but there was air conditioning. And the one infected person, you could see how it circulated around that person, that people around him were infected. And so Marta's exactly right. That's the reason everybody says, don't put your air conditioning on if you're back in your sanctuary. The recommendation that I've seen that actually makes a lot of sense, because we're up at 100 degrees down here. If you're going to have to use it and you don't have windows that can open, and most of my old churches do not, at least put the air conditioning on for 24 hours before, turn it off while people are in the sanctuary so that you're not pushing air around. So at least the air is cooler, and then put it back on when everybody's left.
How does this relate to singing?
So the other thing that is predictive of infection rate is the amount of time that you're in contact with someone who has the virus. And the median peak infection time is, as the studies that I've seen, is 15 minutes. So if you think of singing as 4 minutes of constant coughing, which is about right, that's an increased exposure rate. A cough is 50 miles an hour. Singing is sustained push. A sneeze is about 200 miles an hour. And actually, there have been some studies done where someone has shown someone coughing or singing and then measured the distance that those droplets in a fairly dry environment will travel. So normal speaking is about 6 feet. That's why that's 6 feet to 12 feet. Admonition is there. Singing is 18 to 24 feet. So, so the 6 foot distance that you're doing in your pews, if you're going to be singing hymns, is not sufficient.
My mother's in a care facility, and I took her some things yesterday, didn't see her, but when the door opened, I could hear that the Sunday afternoon church service was going, and they were singing. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that they're required to wear masks when they're out in the common area. I couldn't see how far apart they were. How concerned should they be?
In a closed
singing?
Yeah, in a closed environment. I mean, if they're not wearing masks while they're singing, and it depends on the integrity of the mask. If you've ever tried to sing with a mask on, it's hard, because as soon as you breathe in to get enough air out, you've pulled that mask against your face anyway. So it's not a fun thing to do. I personally would go back and make sure that if they are singing, they've got a mask on at the very least.
And they should be very far apart.
They should be at least 12 feet apart if they can. I mean, if you've got a mask on, you're pretty much restricting airflow anyway. So I don't know it depends on how big the room is and how mobile they are.
And I would totally agree with her on this one. What the question I haven't answered to myself is whether, there's a variation on singing called quiet chanting, whether quiet chanting is okay. There are no studies on that. But the longer we're into this, I'm sure somebody will figure it out from an Eastern Orthodox church or something.
And for those of you that just joined late, Marta is a retired allergist from the Cleveland Clinic. Lisa, talk to us about possible treatments. I think you were hopeful a month or so ago about this 3-drug cocktail that the people were working on, clinical trials, whatever came of some of these treatments.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's throwing the kitchen sink at it, everything from antiviral therapies. There has been some shortening of the time of a disease. You have to realize that these trials are all done with people who are seriously ill. These are not, people who sort of have the virus on the street. These are people who are in hospital or in ICU. So a success in this case is shortening the duration of the disease before they're released from 28 days to 22 days. I mean, it's not like you're curing the disease, but they're looking at a lot of the antiviral therapies. Remdesivir is one of them. It's shown to reduce the time to recovery, I think, down to 21 days. Toximilod is another one. There's some monoclonal antibodies out there that they're throwing at it. Dexamethasone, honestly, a steroid, looks to be one of the better ones, better treatments. And so they're looking at immune modulators. They're looking at anticoagulants, heparin, to make sure that the strokes that are being seen, particularly in the younger population, but 25 to 35, it looks like the virus gets in, and they're not really sure what the mechanism is that I've seen. It's either affecting lung flow so that it eventually affects blood pressure and blood flow, but it actually looks like it's getting into the small vessels, so it's creating mini clots, which is what's leading to the stroke. So they're looking at anticoagulants. They're looking at convalescent plasma, so plasma from people who have recovered from COVID. That's honestly, originally that was really hopeful. The data I've seen recently shows it's not as clear. It doesn't seem to produce the kind of effect that they were hoping it would. And that speaks to the fact that the immune response, the antibody response on this is not clear. Normally in a virus or with a vaccine, you produce enough of an antibody response that the next time that antigen is introduced into the body, your immune response deals with it. Flu is one that changes enough year to year, you have to have an annual flu shot. But you don't have to have, for example, an annual hepatitis B shot or an annual pneumovirus shot, something like that. This one, for everything I've seen, the more mild the infection that you have, the less strong your antibodies are. So they don't last as long and they don't prevent reinfection. Reinfection hasn't been proven, but it looks as if it could be possible because your antibody response doesn't look like it lasts very long either. So at this point, those people who are looking at vaccines are looking at a vaccine and a booster. And it's very possible that this, like the flu, is going to be an annual vaccine because the antibodies don't seem to stick around very long. Now, again, we've only been really looking at this for 4 months now in terms of really getting into clinical trials. But that's the first sort of look at this. So if you've had serious disease, don't want that, but your antibodies are likely to be stronger because the virus load has been bigger and that they're actually expected to last a little bit longer in terms of whatever preventive strength they've got. So right now it looks like dexamethasone, remdesivir, and one of the immune modulators, and there are a number of them. Looks like that three drug cocktail that people are looking at. I don't know, Marta, have you heard of anything else?
No, and to be honest with you, it's so hard to keep up with this. I'm glad I'm talking to you. It's so hard to keep up with all the literature on this that after I foresaw the upcoming epidemic and alerted everybody and tried to take practical measures, I decided to take a break from that portion of my learning. So the only one, I can't keep all my monoclonal antibody candidates straight. But I would agree, those are the other three: remdesivir, dexamethasone, and convalescent plasma. At the end of this, I have a question for you about immunogenicity and syncytial nature. So we'll talk about that later, though.
Cool.
Yeah, they're talking in code here. I don't know what's going on.
Well,
Hermeneutics, eschatology.
Actually, no, but you can talk about it better than I can. Yeah.
Well, I think the bottom line is that there may be things that work to prevent the virus from attaching, which is an early phase problem, to prevent the virus from proliferating, which is sort of a mid-phase problem, and then to either increase your immune response to make you immune, or to decrease the immune response to minimize collateral damage. So the part of the problem is it's not things work or don't work. It depends on what stage in the illness and what mechanism they work on, plus the dose of the particular drug and the circumstances that you need to do. And this is even before you get into individual genetic differences in how people respond. So that's why it's a evolving field, and I read my New England Journal, and that's about it.
I love JAMA. Yeah, I mean, it's that, and there is a genetic component to it. At least they think there is. I mean, you've all seen the studies that say if you've got blood type O, you're less likely to get a serious infection. If you've got blood type A, you're more likely to get a serious infection. I mean, again, these studies are based on small numbers, so it's not real epidemiology. It's more observational at this point, and who knows if that will hold. But there does appear to be some genetics. There does appear to be, it's more than just age. There are other comorbid conditions that, and again, mechanism isn't completely understood. Why hypertension, why cardiac disease, why diabetes, those are all called syndrome X, so they're all sort of metabolic issues. But why do the babies get some variant on Kawasaki disease? That's a stunner. Nobody would have predicted that. And that's part of what makes this quirky, is we're still learning about it, but it's done very unusual things in populations you would not have expected to see that. So
I describe it as building a boat to cross the ocean while you're crossing the ocean.
Yeah, I always say flying an airplane while you're building it, same thing. I mean, we really are just getting into understanding this. And Marta's right. Not only are there different ways of looking at treatment, the same thing is going on with the vaccines that are in development. There are a number of different ways that you could think about creating a vaccine, everything from neutralizing the protein that actually attaches to the cells to doing the what's generally considered normal in a vaccine development, which is attenuating the virus, so making it non-virulent but still infectious so that it gets into the cell but then produces an antibody response. And it's sort of one of each. This is a single strand messenger RNA virus, which means that the other way that they're looking at vaccines is taking the mRNA and truncating it to just a part that, again, is not virulent, so doesn't cause disease, but does get into the cell. And that's never been on the market before. I mean, it's been in development for a while. mRNA virus or vaccines have been around for a while, but they've never been marketed. And so that means they don't have a whole lot of long-term safety data behind them. So that right now, the last I saw, there were 400 different vaccines in development in different places around the world. The US has declared Operation Warp Speed. So they've actually started to fund or do some co-development with 5 different companies. I think all of them, except maybe one, are US companies. All different ways of doing it though. So it's a really interesting puzzle to watch what's in, because that's my background is clinical work, what's in development and how FDA is going to deal with it, how other boards of health are going to deal with it. Right now, they're all in clinical development. The first phase is really limited testing, handful of patients. The second phase is bigger groups of testing where you're looking at efficacy and safety, and they're at the very beginning of that second phase. Most drugs, most vaccines don't get approved until you have thousands and thousands of patients of testing, called phase 3. And that's not going to happen until at least this fall. I think the target for Operation Warp Speed that I saw was January of 2021. So first quarter of next year, they're targeting to have some vaccine out there. How protective it's going to be, how long it's going to last, nobody knows yet.
So from my clinical point of view, the big thing that I've been emphasizing to my people is that the other major public health hazard that has to be dealt with here is the psychological one. And that people really need to turn off the television, do active things, and not obsess the way she and I are about the little nitty-gritties. Absolutely cannot do that. It is perfectly okay to not keep up with anything other than 2 or 3 ways of avoiding infection. And I actually encourage it. The constant, news programs can sell advertising if they have more viewers. How do they get more viewers? They make you nervous, so you become addicted to finding out the latest thing. So I can't emphasize enough that it is not healthy to watch more than a few minutes a day of anything currently, because, especially these case counts, they drive me wild. the case counts are going to go up. So that's not news. Why do we hear it every day?
Right.
Because it hooks people. It's not news. It's totally predictable.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a study that actually came out, and this is not my field, but I read it anyway, about rates of depression and rates of suicidality. And with my daughter now in psychology, that's the reason I read it. The difference between 2018 and 2020 is twofold. So there are twice as many people, because of the isolation primarily, particularly those who are used to church families being a point of contact for them and a point of comfort, and they can't get that. So there's certainly a mental health effect in this as well.
And I have to tell you,
That's
very real. I disagree with the word social distancing. I think it should be physical distancing with social closeness. And that's it's a critical concept. So I'll go on mute now.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
No, and I think that's at the heart of the issue for the pastors and the lay leaders here on the call. I've heard some of our older congregants say, I'm not coming back to worship until there's a vaccine. Well, okay, so we can put our hopes and dreams and treatments and vaccines, but at the end of the day, we're talking about months and months and months then of being socially isolated. And how do we respond to that? And how do we build a bridge to either worship or classes or coming together in new creative ways? What can we do? It's helpful to hear you talk, Lisa, about some things on the horizon, but if those clinical trials don't go well, what do we do?
Right. Yeah, and a lot of them don't. I think I went back and I read one of the seminal books on the 1918 pandemic. Was part of my assigned reading way back when, but I went back and read it again. And, I think, so part of my hope is obviously medical science has made incredible strides from 1918 to now. The types of drugs and honestly, the last 3 years that I spent in this contract research organization, because it was a little one, it dealt with a lot of really novel approaches to everything from sickle cell disease to cancer to multiple sclerosis to you name it, a lot of mRNA platforms. And so medical science has made incredible leaps. The kinds of drugs that they have available now and the kinds of vaccines that they have available now, you couldn't have predicted ever. One of the companies in this Operation Warp Speed is actually the company that I started with. It's Merck Sharp and Dome. They are one of the vaccine powerhouses. And when I was with them, I worked on a couple of different ones, including the Shingles Vaccine. So if you think about shingles, it's basically chicken pox. The virus stays in your body, and that's not uncommon for different types of viruses. Herpes is the same way. There are others. And then it remanifests itself later as shingles. Well, you have a chickenpox vaccine, but because the virus is quiescent and it morphs in your body, you need a different vaccine for shingles. People are surmising that coronavirus might be the same way. But what Merck did, and this is what I loved about that company, they actually did create what's called a recombinant vaccine for Ebola. It's not well known because Ebola is not something we deal with in the US, and it's not foolproof. It's about 75% protective. But they're actually taking that same viral vector and trying to apply it back to coronavirus. And so they're actually one of the ones that is further back in their testing, but it's actually one of the few that's been proven is actually in the market. The other four, two of them are mRNA, two of them are adenovirus that has been modified as a vector, and they're not in the market. So it's just the creativity that's been applied both to how you do worship in this time and space, but also to how you're looking at this virus is really quite stunning.
So I want to caution on this. We can't go back to church until there's a vaccine thing. If this project succeeds and we get, quote, a vaccine in early 2021, it's going to be in limited quantities and restricted to high-risk people.
Exactly
so
right.
Maybe, my guess is it's going to be 2 to 3 years. This is if. before there are adequate quantities to vaccinate, less high-risk people like us older people, high risk meaning healthcare. They're going to start with healthcare workers. So if we have vaccines for healthcare workers this winter, that is the level of progress on vaccine development that I expect. Then moving down to elderly and people with chronic conditions in the next 12 months after that, and then getting down to a more general population in 12 to 24 months. So you cannot say, I'm not going to live a life until there's a vaccine, because it's just going to be a while. So you have to come up with, ways of dealing with it in the meantime. And
Yeah,
this
that's
is
exactly right.
The 1918 epidemic, there were a number of public health measures that worked. We've learned a lot from it. And they couldn't even isolate a virus then. They didn't even know how it spread. They didn't even know it was a bacteria or what. So there's a lot you can do without high-tech measures. So
yeah,
Right,
and
well, and that's-
1918, of course, we had young men barracked at 40,000 in a small room too. So there were other factors, and we were shipping them overseas. But you're absolutely right. The fact that we may have an approved vaccine in January of 21 means that it's not likely available to the general public until 2022 at the earliest, and it will go through additional testing in that time. So I think the other thing to remember when you're talking about going back to church, certainly in the summer, some of the churches down here in Cincinnati have done parking lot worship. They've taken cars to hospitals to pray for the hospital workers, and watching people connect at a distance where they can see each other. I mean, it's a little bit like watching you guys wave to each other on Zoom. It's still social connection. It's not what we're used to. And so, we have to, and I've had a lot of conversations with people about this, there's a difference between idealizing what you thought was normal and embracing what is true for now. And how can you mitigate whatever you're dealing with in the current situation? I mean, we're in a liminal time. There's no question about that. We don't know what's coming yet, but there are ways to manage that, I think, and I know I have one church who's literally 12 people. They're out in a cornfield in Indiana, and they bring their chairs and they bring their own communion, and they sit 8 feet apart and they have worship, and that's what they do. And it's beautiful. It's a really cool thing.
So that's what we're doing at Firelands. We're lucky enough to have built a pavilion a few years ago, and this is our second Sunday where we worship outside with 12 feet of distance between the chairs, and there's some shade in the pavilion, but we definitely worship outside, and we're reevaluating every month what our options are as cold weather comes and so forth.
Well, we've got a number of people on the call here who are masters in Zoom worship now, and experimenting with drive-through worship and outdoor worship kind of experiences. Well, Lisa, you talked a little bit about creativity and with the treatments and the vaccines, and it's funny though, because I think sometimes we can go overboard with the creative ideas, and we want a novel approach to things. But you have been a reminder to me of some of the tried and true things. Like every time we end a call, you say, "And wash your hands." And to me, that's a reminder that contact tracing, washing hands, keeping distance from people who are sick is going to be primary in bringing this R0 number down, what you were talking about earlier. So could you say a little bit about those tried and true things that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting, and Marta brought it up about the current thinking about aerosolization. There was a study that came out of, I can't remember if it was Finland or Norway, that actually looked at how many virus particles were carried on pollution. And that was the sort of the genesis of some of the aerosolization. And my first thought was like, I don't know, it felt like one of those old Japanese horror movies, like, oh my gosh, you can't get away from it. The studies that have been done show that the virus lasts longer on impermeable surfaces, metals, hard plastics, about 3 to 4 days. Doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily get infected by touching it, But as soon as you touch your face, because it is essentially an oral respiratory infection, then the more viral load you get in there, the more chances you're going to get infected. So in any viral or any bacterial potential for infection, the admonition is always wash your hands. I mean, it's everything I needed to learn about hygiene. I learned from my grandmother, wash your hands. Doesn't mean that you have to sanitize everything every day, but the more you do, especially the harder surfaces, the chances are less that you're going to get it. If it's a frequently used doorknob, I'd definitely sanitize that thing. You know, if you are opening your sanctuary, we've talked about this ad nauseum in my group, 6 feet of a line, one in the bathroom at a time, and leave them as many antiseptic wipes as you can. So at least they're wiping down the commonly touched areas. We talked about things like Bibles and hymnals in the pews. You know, those are more permeable. And oddly enough, the virus only lasts about a day or so on those. And so we actually at first cautioned people to take them out so that you weren't trying to disinfect your hymnals every day. The question then came up, well, if I'm only in there for an hour and I close the sanctuary for 7 days, do I really have to disinfect everything? Probably still a good idea, but you know, the answer is 3 to 4 days on hard surfaces, 1 day on permeable surfaces. What do you want a chance? The other thing is, limit the number of things that are touched, obviously. Limit the distance at which you talk to someone. Mask up always. If you're in a public place, to some extent in large groups outdoors. We just had a big rally here on Saturday in Cincinnati called Unify Cincy. It had to be 3,500 people. Did you see the pictures? Yeah. So we had this gorgeous park on the riverfront, and we had 50 churches come together, not just Presbyterian churches from all over Cincinnati. About 50 or 60 churches come together, probably about 3,500 people. We did a half-hour worship on the river, and then we walked from the river up to the main square in Cincinnati and did another worship there. And every single person wore a mask. And it was hard to social distance, but every single person wore a mask. And, you know, we're doing elbow bumps and things like that. So it's become a little bit of the new norm, which is a phrase I hate, but it is. People are getting used to it. And it was 100 degrees on here on Saturday, and people still wore their masks. They had to. So limit contact, limit things like singing. The less that you are putting anything out into the air at this point, the better off you're going to be. Limit the air conditioning. I saw somebody asked a question about heat. Yeah, I mean, you're still blowing air around. So if this is still going on in the winter, you're going to have the same issue. It's going to be dry, hot air. It's not going to be hot, humid air that you get in the summer. So you're going to have those particles hang out and travel more of a distance. Because Marta had it right. It's
with your insurance company, which is hard in Ohio because insurance is weird here, and so everybody's on a different company, different policy, and there are some presbyteries where like 98% of the churches are all on the same, kind of with the same company, so it's easier to talk about these sorts of things. But I say run your plan by your insurance company and make sure. And we've found that most of the insurance companies won't cover it. I mean, because it wasn't something that was, they consider it an act of God, I guess. I don't know what insurance clause it falls. But, and there have been some lawsuits, not in Ohio, not in this area, but in the South, there have been some lawsuits of large gatherings where someone has been infected. Who knows how they'll go in the courts, but at the end of the day, it might not be worth it just from that standpoint. I think, the best question I've heard to give you pause about what is the right approach to getting back together or to gathering people, or do you wear masks or do you put on air conditioning is, and you probably have all seen it too, picture your favorite oldest elder, and do you want that person infected? Picture your favorite person in the pew. Do you want that person infected? Do you want them in the hospital on a ventilator? And so it's just, it's not meant to be maudlin, but it is meant to give you a picture of what reality is. The other piece of this, and again, Marta, weigh in on this one. I've seen probably about 8 or 9 different studies now that are looking at how infectious people are when they're not showing symptoms, because there's quite a range of symptomology in this one. There are people who are almost completely asymptomatic.
the fact that you have been exposed but are what's called pre-symptomatic. So symptoms tend to develop about 2 days after exposure, but you're still infectious. So you can be infecting other people before you even know you have it. You can be completely asymptomatic, never develop a symptom, or get a little cough and you're not really sure and you don't have enough symptoms to be tested, and you're still shedding virus. You're still infecting other people. About the studies that I've looked in some closed situations, they've looked at 90% of the people that they ended up testing had no or few symptoms. The general population studies I've seen are about 35%, 35 to 45% of people who are on the street have no symptoms, but still have the virus and are still infectious. And so the bottom line is, even if you're taking temperatures, you don't know.
Yeah, so this is a problem in a lot of infectious diseases.
Right.
The classic one is measles, where you're absolutely most contagious several days before you get spots.
Exactly.
And it's though that contagiousness is through the roof. Okay, so the big issue on this one is also demographics. So my take on it is that if you have a population that's primarily young, they're going to have fewer symptoms, but clearly it's spreading, so somebody's contagious. The older you are, the more symptoms you're going to have. And so this notion of how many people are contagious and how many aren't is clearly demographically, it's going to be different in the schools than it is going to be in a nursing home. So I think you just have to assume that people around you are there could very well be someone around you who's contagious who doesn't know it. And you're probably more contagious when you're coughing. I mean, I think I caught it from an old lady who coughed on me last March. So sometimes you can figure out who's more contagious, but it's sort of like playing the slot machine. Now, having said that, all risks are multiplied. So if you're next to someone who has a high viral load, who's coughing like a fiend, and you're only 2 feet away and you're there for 2 hours, really not good.
Get it.
Yeah, that's a lot different than maybe 1 in 100 people at the gathering you're at has it, plus you're outdoors, plus you're 6 feet apart, plus everyone is wearing a mask. People say, how can I be safe? And the answer is, life is not safe. It's just a matter of the magnitude of risk. So I tend to focus, as she does, on what are the things that reduce risk. That's mask wearing, hand washing, and actually shorter services. You think about it, you're reducing your risk by 50% if your service is a half hour and not an hour. So, everything, all this stuff multiplies out as reducing risk. So
that's right.
Yeah, so all the things that all the factors that if you multiply increase risk, at the other end, the factors that decrease risk are also multiplicative. Right. So that if that gives you it's not an exact science. So you just have to say, if this makes it safer, then I'm going to do it, because everything that makes it safer is additive or multiplicative action.
Yeah.
And a lot of the arguments at Princeton who thought that we Americans just drizzled on way too much. 20-minute sermons. What is this all about? He thought the key to a good sermon was to keep it under 10 minutes. Well, now here we are. He didn't get his way, but this virus will help us keep our sermon short. That's what I'm hearing, I think.
So was he a closet Catholic?
Oh no, he was Presbyterian throughout his whole life.
We just sold one of our Presbyterian buildings to one of our evangelical Black congregations, not Presbyterian, and I went and celebrated with them, and 3.5 hours later emerged so full of the Holy Spirit. So I guess there's both ends of that spectrum. And I think one more thing to Marta's point, there's a difference between getting infected and how severe the disease that you're going to get is. The bottom line is, we talk about the infection rate, we talk about the hospitalization rate and the ICU rate and the death rate, but nobody really knows what the denominator is. So we really don't know what the death rate is. I mean, flu is 0.1%. This one they say is 5%. Maybe Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 0.2%, and there's just no way to know. And so a lot of people are pushing back on masks by saying, oh, it's not that deadly. You know, we don't know how many people have it. That's actually true. But at this early stage, you sort of, you know, if you have any predisposing conditions, or if you have parents or a population around you that are vulnerable, you almost have to behave as if it's very deadly. Just because you don't want them in the ICU. This morning I was listening to NPR, and ICU beds around the country are starting to get maxed out. I know Houston has now called in the Army Medical Corps to help out because Houston is overrun. Cincinnati's at about 85% capacity. We were nowhere near that when we were quarantined. So that was the reason to do the quarantine in the first place, was to make sure the medical system wasn't overrun. And it did the right thing. It kept the infection rate down. But that infection rate is now on its second leg, and the hospitals are starting to get overrun a little bit. So, and we're back to running out of personal protective equipment. So it's not at crisis stage, but it's certainly something to be aware of. I think I told Matt the other day, Governor DeWine did us a favor when he put this color system in place, because it allows the pastors to have something on the outside, an objective to point to say, no, we're not ready to, you know, to open. And it gets you away from that spectrum of, darn it, I just want to be back in the sanctuary, to, oh my gosh, no, I'm not coming back till there's a vaccine. Now you can point to, if we're red or purple, and it's not completely that way here in Cincinnati, but a lot of the churches are starting to adopt that. If it's red or purple, we're not in the sanctuary. If we go back to orange, we'll look at it. And I think the other thing that I've talked to them about is, this is not a one and done decision. You know, you can go back in the sanctuary and chances are pretty good you're going to have to close again. So make sure you have a good communication plan and a good rubric to be able to say, and here's why we're closing again. And oh, by the way, if somebody in your congregation gets exposed and they're in the sanctuary, you have to let the Board of Health know, and they will do contact tracing and probably shut you down. So, you know, it's a tough decision for sessions. It's really tough to get the pastors, you know, in the middle of it, particularly when I've got a couple of pastors who are highly vulnerable themselves. These are not easy conversations, and Marta's right. We don't have answers. We have learning at this point.
Well, we have some questions. Carol, you want to go first?
Yes, my question is, thank you, Lisa, for saying that we should have a rubric. What data should we be looking at to input in that rubric other than what Governor DeWine is giving us?
That's a good question. I mean, depends on what you're looking at with Governor DeWine too. I've sent out a bunch of different sites, and I've had some pastors and some sessions who have said, well, I can't justify these numbers. They don't match one another, because each site will report at different times of the day based on different sets of data. Some of them lag by 2 or 3 days. There's one that you can do county by county. The CDC public website will allow you to go county by county. And that's probably as good as you can get. You can't really go community by community. It's just, you don't have enough people to really do that. So CDC has a good website where you can look at county by county. I think DeWine is already doing that for you in Ohio. I think that external, we're taking all of these factors into account. And if you're red or purple, I would be really careful. That for me is a nice way to say, I'm not making a subjective assessment, and I'm not telling you what I see in the data. I'm telling you what my governor, what the government sees in the data. There's another one. It's can't remember the acronym now, but I can send the link to Matt. It's another one that does county by county. It's usually 2 days lag, but it's actually pretty consistent with the CDC website. So there's a couple of different places you can look.
Yeah, I check a website daily, and it's interesting that I get it, of course, over my phone, but I get it through the Weather Channel.
Oh yeah, I think that's almost the same as the. Okay. I think it's CTCS is the acronym, but yeah, it's all, you never know. But they're actually not inconsistent. You just have to be careful. The one on the phone, because I've seen it too on the Weather Channel, it's going to flatten the curve a little bit because it's not going to be county by county. Mine is not anyway.
Mine's county by county.
Okay, well, so if you've got that, that'll work.
Question, Dean. Was that you?
Yeah, it's not a question as much as it's a comment, Matt. I hate to give you another job to do, but you're sitting there with nothing to do. So, you know, after this meeting today, I think it would be extremely appropriate for a fairly concise letter to go out to all Presbyterian churches, and I would include ministers, clerks, get 3 people on the letter so that there's a good chance it'll get read at each congregation. And from the safest to the highest risk, and what are the things that churches need to consider as they worship. And, you know, the safest is online, everybody in their own spot. But things we heard today that I think really need to be said to the congregation, and particularly Monroe, where we aren't anymore, is run your AC 24 hours ahead of time and shut the darn thing off during the worship service. We had air running there, and I'm appalled that we were ignorant of that. And I would want that information to go out. We've got LaSalle and Erie back in there, smaller rooms. But there's some good information here. The singing, make sure you're masked singing if you're going to do, and don't think, you know, what we said in Monroe is hum or sing softly like Presbyterians want to do anyway. But, you know, sort of congeal some of the factors we've heard here today and put out a continuum of safety. You know, the worst thing you can do is go unmasked into a sanctuary, jammed in, shoulder to shoulder, sing your hearts out, run the air, and, you know, do everything you can to spread what's ever in that room. I mean, that's the one end of the spectrum, and the other end is just don't even be in there. But, you know, we as, I'll say it because I think some people heard us in the room. We 2 weeks ago met as a congregation in Brooklyn, Michigan. We live in a different presbytery where we worship. And they called the pastor by setting up a 40 by 100 tent outside on grass, no sidewalls on the tent, no singing. Those that felt comfortable sat on chairs 6 to 8 feet apart. The remainder sat in cars and listened on FM. And they had a congregational called meeting and vote for a pastor. And I think everything I've heard today, Lisa, I think they did it as incredibly safely as it could possibly have been done.
Yeah.
And I think if even somebody in that room were contagious, and somebody in that situation were contagious, I think it was incredibly well done.
Yeah, I think the only safer way to do it is by Zoom, and we've done a couple of those. So yeah, you're exactly right.
Mary Beth,
and nothing's foolproof, right?
No.
I just wanted to say that I think that one of the things that we haven't talked about is what are ways that we could gather people back together safely and that don't include worship, because I feel like we're making so many sacrifices to do worship in person, as far as limiting singing, limiting responses, limiting, or eliminating, that what we're doing feels like a glorified Bible study. It doesn't really feel like worship. It's very driven by 1 or 2 people as opposed to a lot of people participating. And so it feels like it would have been smarter, and well, anyway, it doesn't matter what my churches have done or are doing, but it feels like it would have been smarter to start back with smaller physically distanced groups that could just, you know, wear their mask and chat and catch up and whatever, as opposed to rush back to some worship experience that is so less than. So I don't, and I'm trying to figure out now ways to, I guess I'm just throwing this out there, that I think the rush for worship to be the first thing you do and you're back in your building doesn't make any sense to me. I feel like worship should be the last thing you do back in your building. So that's my only comment on that.
No, I think it's a fair one. I mean, I've met, I'm sure Matt has too, with a number of different sessions over the last couple of weeks that are all trying to discern how to come back. And I came back and Matt, I'm happy to share with you anything that I've sent out. My pastors are probably tired of hearing from me. But one of the observations I made to them is the stridency of some people on, we just have to get back to worship. We have to get back in the sanctuary to go to worship. So even worship outside isn't an option. And I sort of wondered out loud with them why that was. So, you know, some people want to get back because they genuinely miss their friends. I get that. Some people want to get back because it was their country club. Some people want to get back because they've never been taught to do their own devotion and Bible reading and worship outside of that 1 hour a week. And they're missing that, you know, and so your question is really good. You know, what's the root cause of getting back into the sanctuary? And is there a way to meet that need without giving them something that's not going to look like what worship looked like before? You know, that normal is not normal. What they idealize as normal is not going to be available to them for a little while. So it's a really good question.
Yeah. Well, and you know, our plan around here has very much been case by case basis, like Lisa's been dealing with, because I've got some large congregations that, with a small congregation that can do the, you know, large sanctuaries with small congregations that can do this well. I've got large congregations with large sanctuaries that aren't even thinking about going back and probably won't until 2021. Anyway, Jean, you had something?
We had a meeting this last week that was supposed to be outside at somebody's house. And I thought, okay, outside, this is good. We got about 8 people coming. And then it was really, really, really hot. And they said, well, we'll just move inside. And I said, oh, not me. No, I'm not. So a couple of us Zoomed in. And I realized that 2 of the 6 people there were wearing masks.
Oh, wow.
And I was kind of going, oh, and I wish now that I had said something, but I came in a little bit late and they were already there. And I thought, okay, we need to move meetings like this into the church where we can say, and you must wear a mask. Because I think it's hard for people in their own homes when someone new comes in to say, where's your mask? You have to put a mask on. So, you know, they were kind of like, well, you know, and I was freaking out because they're sitting around a dining room table in a little tract house and they're all breathing on each other. But
for an hour.
For an hour, right. And I thought, okay, this is a reason to follow up on we need to open our churches for things other than worship. If they come in and use a room that is plenty big for the 8 people to all be well distanced from each other and they wear masks, I at least will feel a whole lot more comfortable about it.
Yeah, and I've been to a bunch of session meetings where there 8-10 people were meeting outside, or we're meeting in a room so large that it's hard to hear one another and such, but I feel like we're doing it safely. Anyway, Ellen, you had a question as well?
Yeah.
Wait, I can't hear you anymore.
I'm concerned about how we as Christians and as pastors and lay people respond to the politicized split that is happening with the virus, and just reading things like, well, only 0.1% of the people have died, it's no big deal. And I guess I'm not asking for a pat answer, but I haven't, you know, when I walk, I mean, I can think of lots of snide answers when I walk by people in the grocery store that don't have masks on. But I just wonder what is a loving and kind way, even though you know that you're not going to change their minds, because they've politicized this. They are not, it's all a matter of, I'm a Republican and I'm not going to wear a mask. When many Republicans do wear masks.
Yeah, I'm going to say, as someone in the middle who's routinely shot at by both ends of the political spectrum, I have to say that I absolutely disagree with stereotyping by either side. Okay, and what I really feel is that the issue of social norms is a very difficult one. And this entire conversation was warped at the beginning because there was a mask shortage. So we were, quote, told masks don't help, end quote. So I gave a number of talks on what they help. It depends what you mean by don't help. This is what they help. This is what they don't help. And so part of it is people's information sources are polarized. Part of it is that the initial push was totally, people switched, the experts appeared to switch direction. So I think what we have to concentrate on is what are the norms in the groups that we belong to, the churches, the smaller communities, and do our best to promulgate those norms as a community. So I totally agree with Jean that it's okay to say when people in our congregation meet in a group, these are what we would like to do. You know, you should wear masks, you should sit 6 feet apart, you should turn off the air conditioning ahead of time. And I agree that a list of high risk and low risk approaches is important. But I also agree that we shouldn't go, we need as groups to set norms. And then people will respond to those norms. You know, individually confronting people, I've never seen it do anything other than harden an opinion. People like to change their minds in private, not in public. And so we need to do everything we can to give people space to change their minds. And some of the people in our congregation who are like, let's just go in and not wear masks, this is a silliness, are in session wearing masks 12 feet apart because they were dealt with respectfully and by a setting of community norms. What we do in our congregation that I think is helpful is that the medical subcommittee, we have 4 of us, a physical therapist who's at the hospital who can tell us what the latest, you know, approaches are at the hospital, myself and 2 RNs, both of whom have fragile husbands, so they have skin in the game. We have, before every session meeting, our medical committee reports to session what we think is appropriate at that point because it's a moving target. So I would encourage people to, if they want to switch people's minds, to do it by informing them, do it in a group setting where nobody has to lose face. People don't like to change their mind if it involves losing face.
Anyone else have a pastoral, loving response that they can give to Ellen's question?
So I'll tell you one thing that we talked a lot about as congregations were discerning whether or not to come back, because most of them are still also doing virtual worship, which I applaud. I mean, that they're reaching people they were never able to reach before. That was a stunning surprise to some of them, a happy surprise. One of the things we talked about was as sanctuaries opened again and people started to show up, and those that are open, it's about 1/3 of the normal, you know, 1/4 to 1/3 of the normal are actually comfortable showing up in the sanctuary. If you're doing both, that the focus of the worship is first and foremost God, but second, it's the people on the virtual, because as soon as you cut them off, they're going to feel like the little kid that got sent to bed while the party's still going on, and they're going to leave, and you're not really worshiping them anymore. And oh, by the way, they're doing the better thing by staying away if they're not comfortable and or they're vulnerable and or they might be infected. They're actually doing the Christian thing. It's not that the people in the sanctuary aren't, but if you make them the focus of your worship and the sanctuary, you know, the people on the Zoom or the Facebook Live are the afterthought, it changes the dynamic tremendously. And what it does is reinforce to the people in the sanctuary that, hey, we still have a viral condition, and they're doing a really good thing by not coming to the sanctuary. So we want to make sure that they are as included or better included, and you're all here as witnesses to what we're creating as a worship experience for them. And it really did change the way some people thought about coming back into the sanctuary versus what's the right thing to do here. It's not exactly an answer to your question, because it doesn't address the people in Kroger, but it did cause some people to think a little bit differently about what's still going on and what is still true.
Yeah, and Lisa, you're talking about what Bruce Reyes-Chow has been spearheading a lot of these conversations.
Yeah.
He has a Zoom laboratory that he does every couple weeks. And a lot of the Tecumseh folks up in Michigan have been part of that. But he's calling it hybrid worship. And I really sense that the folks up in Tecumseh Michigan. David is part of that congregation. They're really committed to hybrid worship, and it's affecting their budgets, right? I mean, we're going to put whatever $3,000, $5,000 into technology as we move forward here, so that when we do go back in person, we're going to try to build a bridge to that new way of doing it, not lose the new when we go back to the old kind of thing.
Yeah, we've even had conversations about, does it have to be that 1 hour on Sunday? So is it only Facebook Live, or do you record it and get a house church of young people with children together on a Tuesday evening? And guess what? That's worship too. So it's even more than just the hybrid. It's really rethinking how the message is delivered and in what stage. In Cincinnati, we have a group that came out of Houston called Missio Dei. They're actually more Reformed and Calvinist than the Presbyterians. They actually use the word predestination in their website. But that's what they've done. They've actually created home churches to spread this out. And it's a really neat community.
Our time is winding down. Any final thoughts, final questions?
Pam had one on the chat about being outside. We're outside, and people, some of them drive in with their masks. If they talk to somebody, they put it on. But do people outside who are distanced need to also wear a mask? Is her question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. My answer would be yes. I mean, until we know where this second wave thing is going, I would take as many precautions to minimize the possibility of infection as possible, particularly if you've got vulnerable populations. And honestly, again, vulnerable, the vulnerability curve goes up as age goes up and as comorbid conditions come up. But don't count out the 5-year-olds. Don't count out the 20-year-olds. They're getting sick too. Right now, 40% of that second wave is the 25 to 40-year-olds. So it's a quirky little virus.
Dean, maybe that's the pastoral response. Maybe that is just to use that word, quirky. This is such a quirky virus. We're trying to do what we can to keep people from getting infected because we don't know so much. But that word quirky might be the pastoral word. I'm being quirky. I'm wearing a mask.
There you go.
Dean, what's on your mind?
Before we end, I think we really need to say thank you to Lisa for taking this time and sharing with us in this group.
My great pleasure. Thank you. I'm glad Marta was there to give her perspective as well.
And I'm not belittling Marta, but she's part of our presbytery, and you've come from afar by electronics. And I thank Matt for your knowledge of knowing her or whatever that brought her here. But I've heard a lot of things today that made me happy that we have somebody of your caliber, or Marta's too, that we can listen to and sort out some of the gobbledygook. I hate to use the term fake news, but misguided news.
Yeah.
And you're not saying you know everything, but I respect your knowledge and your years of experience, and thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And you've got one of my favorite people as your presbyter, so you're in good hands.
Yeah. Well, it's just great to have people like Lisa and Marta around, because I see this from both sides of the political spectrum, right? It's, people say, well, we believe in science, but then I hear people, well, I just don't feel safe. I thought we were going to believe the science. We're doing the best things that we can do, that we're adopting the best protocols and best procedures to keep everyone safe, and to just try to rest in that and provide hope and pave a future, and stop just, well, this is what I pulled from my hip today. No, let's connect back to the science. Let's use the best models and the best opportunities we have to move forward into God's new future. Anyway.
Well, thank you for the chance to talk to you guys. It was really fun to see you all.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. You are just wonderful, and
Be
I
blessed.
love you as a colleague in ministry.
Hey, we have fun. Matt and I have fun together.
So Lisa, I need more contact information for you.
Matt knows how to get a hold of me. Absolutely.
I'll connect you two up.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be a lot of fun.
Thank you all. This our time together was a little extended today, but I think it's been good. I bid you all peace.
Good luck, stay safe, and wash your hands. And wear your masks.